So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for finding time during a really challenging week when a lot of people in Ontario got news that was both not unexpected, but also tough to process. The fact that we're not going to have our kids returning to the classrooms in the next few weeks. That's been a bit of a psychological blow, I know, to a lot of parents. On the one hand, there's been a lot of relief, knowing that, you know, it's the best thing from a public health perspective, but also that feeling of, wow, like summer vacation has been going for a while, I guess, and it's going to be going for a few months longer. So I've noticed a lot of different emotions from parents in the last day or two. And I just wanted to start out by acknowledging that in case you're feeling a little bit flooded with all the emotions tonight. You're certainly not the only one. And I'm really happy that just by sheer coincidence, this webinar happened to be scheduled for today. So you've had 24 hours to process some of those emotions, and we can certainly talk about some of the things you're thinking and feeling and wondering about when we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation later on. But for now, let's dive in and talk about taking good care of your kids during this really challenging time. Part one really focused a lot on you, and now we're shifting the focus more to helping your kids, supporting them, and making conscious and deliberate parenting choices in this moment. And of course, there will be overlap, because we can't just talk about your kids as if, you know, you're some magical invisible being that inhabits your house. Not at all. I mean, it's an active relationship and engagement between you and your child. So let's start out by talking about some of the reasons why so many kids are having a really hard time right now. And I've been reading a lot of the sort of public opinion, public affairs polling on this issue. There have been a couple of studies that have come out in recent weeks where they've talked about the issues and that are top of mind for kids and the behaviors and struggles that parents are noticing and commenting on. So I thought it might be helpful to share a few highlights from that data with you, just to sort of acknowledge the extent of the challenge from a kid's perspective. So first of all, I think kids are really having a hard time with the shift in their routines. You know, when you're a school-age child, you're pretty much into the groove of the school year. Starts in September, it finishes in June. I go to school every weekday, you know, 9 till 3:30 or whatever the exact time frame may be, but you're into pretty much a routine. All of that was ended very abruptly back around the time of the March break, and the March break just never ended. So that was a big adjustment for kids. And because we didn't know what was going to happen, a lot of kids up until now have been holding on to hope that they would get to go back to school and see their friends, and you know, that a lot of the standard landscape of childhood would suddenly become familiar again, and that just isn't going to happen in the short run right now, right? So that change of routine is really hard for kids. Like all of us, children are creatures of habit, and they take such comfort in the familiar and the predictable. And that's simply not the reality of this particular situation right now. And of course, coping with change is much harder than for some kids than it is for others. I honestly feel, as the parent of some sometimes really intense kids during their growing up years, like some of my kids I felt were almost allergic to the idea of change. And so I know some of you probably are dealing with children who are having a really hard time, because it's not easy to pivot and go with the flow for many kids, especially at a time when they've been asked to make so many changes and cope with so much uncertainty for so long. So that is a big thing. Even just what happens in the household on a daily basis is very different than our norm. I mean, the Ipsos poll that came out, that was sort of sponsored and done in conjunction with Children's Mental Health Ontario, among others, just looked at some sheer changes to the daily habits of children in terms of watching more TV. 53% of kids report watching more TV. 52% are spending more time playing video games. 47% are spending more time online. So that is like a huge shift in terms of what the day-to-day schedule of a particular child would typically be. Another reason why it's really hard for kids is that, of course, they're picking up on the overall mood of anxiety in our households, in our communities, in our culture, in our world. It's just like layers and layers of anxiety. And even very young children, even if you're the parent of a baby or a toddler, you've probably noticed that your child is picking up on your anxiety even at that age. They don't have any way of processing the news. They don't have words for what is going on, but they can sense that something in the world and in their family feels a little different. And that can be really disconcerting to a child. I've had some conversations with parents of toddlers in recent weeks who've told me that their toddlers aren't sleeping like they usually do, or they're much more clingy, or they're just having complete fits about things that normally wouldn't bother them. That's all stress behavior. It's all perfectly normal and acceptable under the circumstances. We totally would expect toddlers to be having a hard time, but it can be disconcerting to you as the parent to realize how anxiety ripples out and affects children in such a profound way. The researchers from that Ipsos poll said that 22% of parents and kids are reporting that there's increased tension and sort of stress within the family, because when parents feel stressed, kids feel stressed. And when kids react to that stress with acting out behavior, parents feel more stressed, and it can sort of become a little bit of a downward spiral. So I think a lot of us are feeling that as well. Kids are also feeling anxious because of what they're picking up on in the news. I think it's wise to realize that we can't totally protect kids from knowing what's going on right now. That wouldn't be healthy for them, and it wouldn't be honest. It would jeopardize their trust in us, the parents. But we also don't want our kids to feel like they're totally immersed in every single news story 24/7. I mean, there are days that I have to turn off the news. I'm an avid news consumer, but some days I know I've just hit my limit. I can't read one more article that's talking about either a personal tragedy or trying to predict where things are going, and in sometimes not exactly optimistic ways. So if we have to protect ourselves from news overload as grown-ups, I think we also have to be mindful of how much news and what kind of news our kids are being exposed to. I mean, there are a lot of joyful things in the news. I'm sure you've enjoyed seeing some of the videos of, choruses of orchestras and singing choruses performing remotely but together. That is really uplifting. And of course, there have been a lot of hilarious TikTok videos. I'm not cool enough to totally grasp the whole TikTok concept, but I do enjoy watching the videos when they pop up on Instagram and on Twitter and so on. So I think that we want to watch how much news the kids are absorbing, and I think we also want to be prepared to respond to their worries and concerns. And this is on a couple of different levels. I mean, you have to think about what is the child's developmental stage? What are they wondering about? What are they worrying about? And be able to anticipate and address those particular worries. And also just being aware that they may be overhearing things and hearing little snippets of information, and maybe information that out of context isn't accurate or is overly alarming. So we have to find out, what are they thinking, what are they hearing, and how can we address some of those underlying concerns. So a lot of stuff. And in terms of the specific worries, Angus Reid actually did a really detailed study of what kids are worried about. And they are worried about a lot of things. I want to actually share this data with you just because you may be able to relate to some of these worries, having heard some of this from your own children. So 29% of kids are worried about missing out on the next school year, so meaning the school year starting in September. At the time this study was done, the current school year was still up in the air. And at that point, 27% of them were worried about missing out on the current school year. So obviously that worry has been realized this week for a lot of kids. 26% are worried about family members other than their parents getting sick. So maybe a grandparent or a sibling or somebody else that they really care about. 22% are worried about parents getting sick from COVID-19. 20% are worried about parents either losing their jobs or potentially losing their jobs. 15% of kids are worried about getting sick themselves, and 12% in this particular study said that they're worried about tensions or arguments at home. That is a long list of worries for children to be carrying around and processing on a day-to-day basis. So I think we need to talk a little bit about how to address some of children's specific fears. I think the big thing is to think about what your child is capable of processing developmentally, what their stage of development is. It's just like when you have the facts of life talk with your child, you're going to have a conversation in a very different way with a teenager than you would with a 3-year-old who's just trying to figure out what are these body parts all about. So I think we have to sort of like moderate or modulate the conversation on that basis based on what a particular child is capable of understanding, and thinking about the language that you choose so you don't accidentally cause them to become more worried because something sounds really alarming or they just aren't quite sure what it is you're talking about. I think we want to have a conversation that is factually accurate. It is accurate to say that this is a dangerous virus and that we don't totally understand how it's working. So I think we can be honest and frank about that, but then we need to pivot to reassurance, to letting kids know that we are doing everything in our power as the adults in the family to keep them safe, and that right now we're doing all the things that health experts are recommending. We're physical distancing, we're washing our hands, we're doing all those important things, and that not only are we keeping our own family safe, we're helping to keep other people in the community safe. And that's a really powerful and validating message for kids, because you're giving them the opportunity to actually make a difference in a time when they may be feeling like they've lost a lot of control in their life. So that can be really empowering and really positive during an otherwise really difficult time. Okay, so I want to talk now about calming your child. In part 1, we talked a lot about calming yourself, and of course there'll be some overlap because what works for parents also works for kids. But I think it's really important to recognize the important role that you as the parent have to play in this process. That whole mantra of calm yourself, calm your child. Think about what it means to be a calming presence in another person's life. You want to be their safe place and their person. So often we can think about times in our life when we've had this kind of connection with somebody and how amazing it felt just to be in that person's presence. And I think sometimes just doing a little bit of mental time travel, taking yourself back in time, remembering what it was like to be a child and who you felt really safe and secure with. That can be a wonderful prompt to you of creating that sense of calm for your child. I think we also have to remind ourselves that our kids at every stage of their development benefit from us helping them to get to that place of calm. It's a process called co-regulation. We often talk a lot about self-regulation, which is when you yourself regulate your own behavior or your child themselves regulates their own behavior. But we also have to recognize that throughout life, we co-regulate. We lean on another person to get to that place of calm. And I mean, it starts when you have a very young baby and you use soothing motions and conversation, and just being in that place of calm yourself helps your child to understand what it feels like to be calm. And so that eventually they can learn to get to that place themselves. But this isn't just for little babies. I mean, children at all ages, even other adults, really need the calming presence of another person. So I remember, for example, when we were watching the horrifying news on September 11th, many years ago, I remember watching that television coverage, just feeling horrified and terrified and afraid for the world, and picking up the phone to call my dad. And I remember talking to my mom. My dad was taking a nap at the time, and she said that she'd get him to call me back. And I just literally sat there waiting by the phone for that return phone call. And all I wanted to know was, Dad, can you tell me, is everything going to be okay? And he's very honest. So he said he honestly didn't know, which I appreciate. But he also talked to me and recognized that, yes, this was really scary. And no, we didn't know what we were dealing with. and just really helped me to at least feel that my worries were being heard in that moment. So I think that like that's when that happened. I mean, I was well into adulthood. I had kids of my own, and yet turning to my dad for that kind of anchor and support felt good on an otherwise terrifying and totally, you know, mind-blowing kind of day. We're in a similar place right now, and so we can be that person for our kids on days when they're feeling like this is too hard or I'm really scared, just to be that calming presence. So I talked a little earlier about the importance of talking to kids about what they're thinking and feeling. Sometimes parents are afraid to start a conversation like this with a child who's really quiet, thinking, well, won't I just put worries in their head? They've already picked up on the fact that something is going on. Either they're old enough to have heard stories in the news, or they've picked up on your body language, or they've heard snippets of conversations. So if you don't say anything about what's happening, their imagination has to just go off on its own. And a child's imagination can be a very powerful thing. So they might imagine things that are even more terrifying, because the message they get is, this is so scary that people can't even tell me what's going on. That's really terrifying. And that's where children get very, very frightened and afraid. So do have conversations, ask them what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and be willing to feel all those emotions with them. It can be really painful when your child is upset and sad and disappointed and angry and frustrated. It can be exhausting, but it's also really important to be there for your child and to give them the message that there is no emotion that's too big for you to bring to me. I have strong enough shoulders to help carry that emotional load with you, and that we can get through this together. I think that's all kids really need to know, is that they don't have to get through this scary time by themselves, that they can turn to you for support and encouragement, and that that's probably the healthiest thing that they could do. Again, I think I've probably mentioned this at least once last week, and probably even in some of our sessions last year. Try not to be triggered by what feels like your child's super annoying behavior. When children are under stress, they act out in all kinds of different ways. And of course, we're already under stress ourselves. So what might be mildly annoying at the best of times can be super annoying at the worst of times. And we're somewhere between the best and the worst of times right now on a day-to-day basis, right? So I think just asking yourself, what is my child trying to tell me with their behavior? What is the underlying message that that behavior is trying to articulate? And sometimes even the child doesn't know. They're so frustrated, they're so overwhelmed, they're so upset that they're just throwing a fit about something. And it's only when you sit down and you have a conversation, or you just hold them, that they can let go of some of that emotion, and then the two of you can find your way to a happier place together, figuring out what is actually the underlying need and how might you meet that need. It can also be helpful to encourage a child who's particularly inclined to worry about everything, and trust me, I was that kind of kid, to take little mini vacations from the worry. You're not telling them that, you know, they can never worry about the coronavirus again, or they can never tune into the news again. You're just saying, for the next half hour, let's just pretend that none of this is happening. Let's play a game of Monopoly, or read a story together, or go for a walk, or do whatever is possible for your family in that moment, and just take a break from the intensity of the situation. Sometimes I do this. I will try to unplug, like for long chunks of time on the weekend, and I'll try to leave my phone in another room. Of course, if I hear a little vibration, I immediately think I am a mom. I have to check my phone and make sure everybody's okay. But even just not seeing it in front of me all the time, reminding me that there might be another news story to check, that can be really liberating for me. Or losing myself in a book. So figure out what kind of strategies would work best for a particular child. If you have a child who has a wonderful sense of humor, it might be watching something hilarious together. If you have a child who's really high energy and physically, you know, a go-getter kind of kid, maybe it's doing something like chasing a frisbee around or something together. I don't know. You know your child best, so you'll be able to figure out what would be the best strategy for them. But the whole idea is to take them a mini vacation from the worry. And here's something really interesting that I didn't know until a couple of years ago. I used to think that a good way to relax would be just to like flop out on the couch and stare mindlessly at a movie or a TV show. It turns out that you're actually better to engage in an activity that requires more cognitive work on your part, because while you're watching the TV, your mind could wander and you could start thinking about the 10,000 things you're worried about. Whereas let's say you're doing one of those Sudoku, my dad likes those puzzles, the math puzzles, right? If you have to focus on something like that, or a crossword puzzle, or even a jigsaw puzzle where you're looking at the 10,000 pieces to try to find the one that actually goes in this space, it requires enough attention that your mind can't be doing those laps around the block where you just keep circling around the worries over and over again, which is mentally exhausting. So think about an activity that might actively engage your attention for a period of time, so that way, when you go back to just ordinary life, you feel like you actually were able to park that worry for a while. Let's talk a little bit about why routines matter so much and how prioritizing some of the health fundamentals is more important than ever. As I said earlier, kids are creatures of habit and they're noticing changes. We all feel so much more reassured and comfortable when there's like a predictable rhythm to life. So it's not like we're trying to say that you have to have a detailed schedule. That would probably be more stressful in this moment. You want to have some flexibility built in, but just having a plan on how the day is going to play out and when you're going to have your meals and when you're going to maybe get some physical activity, trying to sort of put those pieces of the puzzle together. That provides a bit of a rhythm and flow to the day, and it ensures that you're not up, you know, like you're sitting there at 8 o'clock at night realizing that nobody's thought about what to eat for dinner and everybody's starving and in a terrible mood. Or it's midnight and you just realize that the 6-year-old is running around in circles, completely spun out because they are so overtired. Just having those fundamentals in place. And of course, there will be days when all the wheels come off the bus, right? There'll be days when maybe people don't get to bed as early as they should, or something goes wrong, but at least you have like a working plan to help try to keep yourself on track. So I think that's really important. I'm going to get to some specific schedule related worries in a little while, like particularly with sleep habits. As Mary said at the beginning, I did pay really careful attention to your questions and I sort of worked them into the appropriate points of the presentation. So some of the people who were asking some questions about schedules and routines, I will be addressing those concerns. So I just didn't want you to think I'd missed your question there. I think it can be really helpful also to figure out when a child is experiencing sort of like garden variety anxiety, which everybody would expect every person on the planet to be feeling right now, versus something a little more serious where maybe you think you should be reaching out to the family doctor or to somebody else for some support because you're seriously worried about your child. So I think it's helpful to recognize and remind ourselves that everybody experiences some degree of anxiety. You can't be a human being on the planet, even on the best day of your life, and not have the odd little, anxious moment. But that's very different from experiencing a debilitating level of anxiety where anxiety starts to interfere with your quality of life. And that's what I think some parents are starting to worry about. So I think we don't want to hit the panic button and assume that every child on the planet right now is dealing with an anxiety disorder, but we also don't want kids to be struggling to a huge extent and think, oh, that's just typical for this situation, that somewhere in that middle ground is some sensible middle ground, right? So when do we worry about anxiety becoming a problem and maybe crossing over into disorder territory? Well, we worry about it when it arises suddenly and unexpectedly for no apparent reason, or when it's rooted in a worry about something that's highly unlikely to happen. So if your child started being really worried that a dinosaur was going to break in through the front door and eat everybody while you were asleep, that would be sort of something that's highly unlikely to happen. So that would be, you know, at that end of things. But a child who's worried that somebody I care about might get sick, that's not an outlandish worry, right? That's a very legitimate and reality-based worry. So, but if it gets to be out of proportion, like your child can't stop thinking about that worry about you getting sick, it's all they want to talk about, they're completely hysterical, they can't let go of this idea even for a moment, then that, even though it's a very realistic worry, it could be that they're experiencing it in a way that's much more intense than you might typically expect. And if it becomes far-reaching and long-lasting, your child isn't just a little bit anxious for a day or two, but you notice this is a prolonged reaction. It's going on for a long time, or it's extreme. Your child isn't sleeping at all. Your child is crying all the time. Your child has lost all hope that things could get better. Just think of sort of like the magnitude. And sometimes you can't really tell, like, is there cause for concern? Or is there not cause for concern? And my rule, my guiding principle as a parent has always been, if in doubt, check it out. Because that's why we have access to healthcare providers and mental health support people, because they've had experience dealing with not just like 1, 2, 3, or 4 kids in a family. They've had experience dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of kids. So they can quickly figure out if indeed there is cause for concern and give you some strategies for supporting your child and let you know if your child might benefit from some additional treatment or support. So because it is important to know 1 in 8 children in the best of times is struggling with anxiety to an extent that it's starting to interfere with their quality of life. In typical times, these would be the kids who don't want to go to school. They experience school refusal, or they have extreme social anxiety, or they have like a huge phobia of something. Something is just interfering with their ability to get on with the job of just enjoying being a kid. So that is an issue at the best of times, and of course we're not exactly living through the best of times right now, and all the mental health experts that I've been talking to in recent weeks are anticipating that we're going to need a lot of additional mental health treatments and supports for parents and kids and all humans as we work through and come out the other side of the pandemic, because a lot of people are dealing with grief and trauma and prolonged stress and all kinds of different layers of worries. It's important to note that some kids are probably a little more predisposed to anxiety disorders than others. For example, certain kinds of challenges kind of coexist. So if you have a child with ADHD, or you have a child with an eating disorder, or a child who struggles with depression, those children would be more likely to also be struggling a little bit more with anxiety. And we know that certain kind of behavioral patterns tend to run in families, whether it's genetics or environment or a little bit of both. Some families will struggle more together during this time. I think I told you in the last session that I live with bipolar disorder, which means that I have more extremes of moods. Like when I'm on top of the world, I feel fantastic. When I'm anxious, I feel pretty terrible. And so I've had to learn strategies for sort of like modulating my emotions. So instead of going up and down like a, I guess like big peaks on a mountain, just trying to keep things into more of a center middle ground. So if you are somebody else who struggles with anxiety, or you have a child who struggles with anxiety, I think it's really important to know that things can get better. Things don't always have to be as hard as they are right now. It's usually a matter of figuring out what it is you're dealing with, learning some strategies, and then getting on with the business of enjoying your life, because it can be managed in all kinds of proactive ways, but it starts with learning those strategies that can be truly life-changing. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the behavioral challenges and changes that parents have been noticing, again, drawing from some recent data from the Ipsos poll. So there's a lot going on. I mean, every time I look at this list, it kind of blows my mind, but 31% of kids are having difficulty sleeping or their sleep patterns have changed. 26% have had changes in eating habits. 17% have had outbursts or extreme irritability. 16% are having difficulty concentrating. 13% have exhibited drastic changes in mood, behavior, and personality. 12% of kids have been withdrawing from other people or avoiding social interactions. 12% have been experiencing frequent headaches or stomach aches, and 5% have been dealing with persistent sadness. That is a really disturbing list showing the extent of the impact of the pandemic on children. Children are really struggling. And I emphasize this because we talked last week about how parents are struggling so much. And I think sometimes when you are feeling completely overwhelmed yourself, it's easy to sort of like pull inward and only think about how you are experiencing this. So I think it's important also, even if you are in that really rough place yourself, to broaden your focus a little bit and sort of think about what does this also mean at the same time for your child, because it is really hard for them as well. And this is actually a perfect point to pivot to a couple of specific worries that were on the list of questions that some of you submitted ahead of time. So one parent wrote and said that they were really worried about a teenager who was sleeping in a little bit more. Instead of getting up at the normal time that she would get up in the morning to go to school, she was maybe sleeping in an extra hour or two. And I told that parent I wasn't I've had this conversation a few times lately. I told that parent I wasn't too concerned about a little bit of sleeping in. Like sleeping in just a little bit is basically a teenager responding to their natural sleep rhythm, where their bodies naturally get sleepy around midnight or even 1 in the morning, and then they want to sleep in till 9 or 10 in the morning. That is perfectly normal, and it's probably a really good strategy for a teenager who's feeling overwhelmed by the situation and who then can get the sleep that they need to function at their best. So that's probably a really good thing. That's very different than a teenager who's staying up till 5 a.m. and crashing for a couple of hours and then taking a nap in the afternoon and then is up all night the next night. I mean, that is not great from a mental health perspective, and kids can get really out of sleep or out of sync with the normal sort of sleep rhythm. So I would be more concerned about that kind of thing. And also when people are under stress, including of course teenagers, some of us process all those emotions by sleeping a little more. It's almost like our brains do some thinking behind the scenes that we can't necessarily do this to the same degree in the day, and we're exhausted from all the emotions we're carrying around. So it might actually be a really healthy response to a really difficult situation. Another parent was worried about their teenager being really withdrawn and spending a lot of time in their room. I think in this case, I would want to look at the extent of that isolation. Like, is it that they only come out for 15 minutes for dinner and the rest of the time they're hibernating in their room? Or is it more of a coming and going all day? Like you're seeing them, but they are spending a lot of time in their room. I would worry more about the kid who's almost in total isolation, just because I think they would benefit from that co-regulation, that being in the presence of a calming person like a parent. But I think we also have to recognize that for some kids, this will be their way of coping. Maybe in order to process all their feelings of worry, guilt, disappointment, they need that solitude when they can just sit there and be with their emotions. I think that as the parent, what I would suggest is just continuing to reach out to make sure that that child knows that they're valued, that you still want to connect with them, and yet you're respecting their privacy within a particular amount, right? Not you can totally isolate yourself in your room, and also we're not going to barge in every 20 minutes to see if you're okay. We know you just need a little time and space. And sometimes I think it's an effect of being in the presence of other people all the time, like that can be exhausting. Even if you love your family members, as most of us do, some of us at this point, so many months into the pandemic, are just craving a little solitude and space to ourselves. So I think that could be part of the equation for a lot of teenagers, where their room is the only place they can go in the house where they can truly be alone, if only for a little while. Another parent was really worried about a teenager who was socially anxious at the best of times and was missing out on some of those opportunities for social contact because of the need for physical distancing. And another person had a related worry about a teenager who doesn't like to connect with other people via screens. So if they don't want to use screens right now, that really limits your opportunities for social interactions. So both of these parents basically had a very similar worry, which was about teenagers becoming socially isolated and withdrawing and not having that interaction with peers, and wondering what they could do to help those kids to still benefit from, sorry, I'm just going to move a little bit because the sun is in my eyes. Nice problem to have at this time of year, right? They still want their kids to have some kind of social interaction. So I think that even though you might prefer that they engaged with their peers a little bit because you're worried about them missing some of that peer contact, don't underestimate how much of an impact you and your family can still have on their social skills and their ability to maintain their social skills during this challenging time, just by reaching out, having those conversations, spending time with them. There's so much research that shows that the way teenagers assess how much they're loved by their parents is actually by keeping track of how much time we want to spend with them. And I always feel like they reserve the right to say thanks, but no thanks to you, but they want you to keep trying to do that outreach. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. So I want to talk a little bit about anxiety, and then shortly we're going to pivot to the broader discussion that we'll be having together. I think that it's helpful to know that some things make anxiety better and some things make anxiety worse. So if you have a child who's really anxious right now, which is probably a fair number of people, you probably don't want to telegraph your own anxiety. You don't want to sort of let your child know that you're super anxious about all these things, because that can help to fuel their anxiety. You also don't want to provide excessive reassurance where you're constantly trying to fix everything, because they do need to learn how to become at least a little comfortable with the uncomfortable emotion that is anxiety. They have to sort of find their own zone of managing this. In terms of what helps to make anxiety better, understanding how anxiety works. When you have something really anxiety producing happen for the first time, it can be really alarming. Think of the kid who's never had butterflies in their stomach or a dry mouth or had trouble sleeping or experiencing any of those anxiety related symptoms up until now, wondering like, is there something seriously physically wrong with me? Especially in a time when everybody's talking about COVID-19, it could be very scary for a kid who just doesn't understand that this is how your body responds to anxiety. They need to know that simply being able to label the emotion helps to tame the anxiety. So being able to say to themselves, what I'm feeling right now is anxiety, I am anxious, and maybe articulating that to another person, that can be really helpful both in terms of taming the emotion and getting somebody else to recognize that you're having a really hard time and to support you in working through some of that anxiety. It can be helpful to encourage them to figure out which strategies in managing their anxiety work best for them. We talked earlier about parking the worry. Other kids might need to sort of physically let off some steam. I know our options are a little limited right now, but maybe there's a way to, jog on the spot or go for a run up and down the street if that's safe, or go for a bike ride, just whatever is possible that would help them to physically work through some of that pent up energy that is often a byproduct of anxiety. For other kids, it's learning how to manage the feeling in their body so that if they feel like they're all tensed up like this, helping them to practice progressive muscle relaxation, where you sort of like tense up and then release the the energy or the tension in that part of your body. You can literally do it from head to toe. Works really well with school age kids who are a little younger, as they learn, like, you know, you can sort of tense up like a ball and then release it, and just that feeling of release. It can actually make you sleepy. So it's a great activity to do at 3 a.m. if you happen to wake up and you're having a hard time getting back to sleep. It's really important to help kids to accept even these feelings of anxiety. We talked last week about how hard it is and how cognitively demanding it is on your brain if you're trying to suppress anxiety. Kids need to understand that as well, that you're better off facing your worries head on, articulating them, and turning to other people for support in managing those particular emotions that might feel way too big for you to manage on your own. I have given you in the handout that you're going to get after the workshop a couple of suggestions of different activities and games that you might want to work through with your kids depending on their age. These probably skew a little younger. They're probably of greater interest to younger school age kids than teenagers. Probably most teenagers, if you suggested these activities, they would roll their eyes and give you a very scathing look. So I do not recommend that. But just a game like playing a motion detective with a younger child, where you're watching a movie or a TV show together and you try to sort of label all the emotions that different characters exhibit as you're watching the show or reading the book together. And maybe getting your child to connect the dots back to their life, to pivot to you know, a time when they felt that particular emotion that that character is exhibiting. Or doing an emotion collage where you know, like the old classic piece of art where you cut out words and you find drawings that articulate what it is you're feeling. I think nowadays we call it a visualization board or a mood board or whatever, but in the olden days it was more of a collage. So just some kind of art project that gives you a vehicle for capturing and talking about the emotions that your child might be feeling. Or coming up with a coping strategies roadmap where you know, you have your child figure out where they are now and where they want to be in terms of feeling happier and healthier, and then map out strategies that will help to take them from here to there. Or an emotion journal, just capturing what it is you're feeling in this moment. This can be helpful for a child who swears they're never happy or that everything is always terrible, because sometimes they can catch themselves actually feeling happy or grateful if they jot down a few memories of those kind of experiences in their journal, as opposed to just collectively at the end of the day. I mean, we know our brains tend to skew negative as humans. So sometimes you could have like a day that was pretty good, and then the last hour was terrible. And at the end of the day, you could say to yourself, the whole day was terrible. We have a tendency to do that. So we can challenge our kids to actually look at how the day really did play out. We can also help our kids to work through a lot of feelings of disappointment. I think if that's the flavor of the month for May, I think it would be disappointment, because so many children are dealing with everyday disappointments, like not being able to see their friends at schools, and more crushing disappointments, like maybe not getting to say goodbye to the friends who will be going off to different colleges and universities, and that they might not see in the same way ever again. There's a lot of disappointment in the air, and summer camps, you name it. I'm sure you can think of 10 different disappointments in your own life. So we need to acknowledge those, we need to grieve some of those losses, and then we need to help our kids to hold on to hope that things can get better, because I honestly believe they do, they will, and they can. And I don't know what that looks like, but I honestly feel like we as the parents have the ability to sort of help our kids to hold on to hope in an otherwise really difficult time. And so now I want to open up the conversation, because I think that the fact that we're all here together, we're all caring so much about kids and about other parents, we have a real opportunity to offer support and encouragement to one another, as well as to talk about the things we're dealing with in our families right now. And I know we had an amazing discussion last week. I'm hoping we can have something similar tonight, and just, you know, really be the village for one another. So I'm going to throw it over to the question tag team, the behind the scenes team of experts, to let us know where we go from here.
Lastly, Anne, thank you. You've been a wonderful supporter of Erin Mills Connects. You've given us all a lot of wonderful information, great strategies we can all take away to help us through this unprecedented time that we are in. Thank you to all of you for participating this evening. You've been a great audience. We've really appreciated having you. Thank you for signing in. Thank you for supporting us as a community organization. We really appreciate it. I wish all of you a wonderful rest of the evening and a great week ahead. Beautiful weather in store that we can all get out in this time of COVID. I think a little bit of fresh air and exercise, as Anne mentioned, is a wonderful strategy. So good night, all of you, and thank you again for participating.
Thanks, everybody.